During a heated podcast discussion, Chris Rock tried to put Ibrahim Traoré on the spot with tough questions and sharp remarks. But Traorés.com measured response not only silenced the room, but left Chris visibly emotional and eventually in tears. This unforgettable exchange shows the true power of empathy and wisdom. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Ibrahim Traorés' team received an unexpected invitation. Chris Rock, the world-famous comedian and podcaster, wanted to host him live. On his show, the invitation raised eyebrows in Ouagadougou. Chris was known for his sharp tongue and blunt questions. Few world leaders dared to appear on his podcast, and those who did often left embarrassed. Ibrahim didn't hesitate. "Tell him I accept," he said calmly. His advisors warned him. "Mr. President, he might disrespect you on air," as a way of making even the strongest people stumble. But Ibrahim just smiled. A man cannot stumble when he walks in truth. The next day, he boarded a flight to New York. The world buzzed with anticipation. News outlets speculated that Chris would break the young African leader and expose his flaws. In Burkina Faso, millions of his people crowded around TVs and phones, waiting to watch their president defend himself. But Ibrahim wasn't worried. As the plane took off, he sat quietly, his hands folded, whispering to himself, "Patience is stronger than anger. Let's see what tomorrow brings." By Thursday morning, the studio was packed. Bright lights, cameras ready, and Chris Rock at the center of it all, smirking as Ibrahim entered. Chris stood up and extended his hand. "Well, Mr. President, welcome to the hot seat," he said with a chuckle. Ibrahim returned the handshake firmly, replying, "Thank you, Chris. I hope this seat is as warm as your heart." The audience laughed nervously. From the very first question, Chris came hard. "So tell me," he began sharply, "you talk about humility, yet you're the head of a military government. Isn't that hypocritical?" Ibrahim didn't flinch. He listened, quietly nodding as Chris fired more pointed remarks. "Your critics say you're too young, too inexperienced. Some even say you're just another power-hungry soldier. What makes you different?" The room grew tense. Chris leaned forward, his voice biting. "Do you really believe the people love you, or do they just fear you?" The audience gasped at the question. Camera zoomed in on Ibrahim's face, but his calm expression never broke. He leaned forward, folded his hands, and looked Chris right in the eyes. "Let me tell you a story," he began softly. The studio fell silent as Ibrahim began his story. "There was once a boy," he said, his voice low but steady, "who grew up in a village so poor his mother had to choose which child got to eat that day." Chris froze, caught off guard. The audience leaned closer. That boy watched his father die, not because of war, but because no doctor would come to their village. He learned then that fear doesn't lead people, love does. Ibrahim's eyes glistened. As he continued, "That boy was me." Chris blinked, visibly moved, but tried to keep his composure. "So, you're saying you lead because you care?" Ibrahim nodded. "I lead because I remember what it feels like to be invisible, to feel like no one is coming to help. If I don't care for my people, then who will?" The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Even Chris seemed at a loss for words. His sharp grin replaced with a quiet stare. And for the first time that day, the audience began to applaud softly at first, then louder until it filled the room. Chris Rock stared at Ibrahim Traoré after the last words fell from his lips. The room was still. The cameras kept rolling. Silence was louder than applause. Chris finally broke it, leaning back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Okay, that was deep," he muttered. But then his tone sharpened again, almost like he was trying to get back control. "Still, a sad story doesn't mean you get a free pass as a leader. You're a president, not a motivational speaker." Ibrahim didn't react. Instead, he asked, "Chris, can I ask you something?" "Triste." Chris nodded. "Have you ever truly been hungry? Not for food, but for dignity?" Chris didn't answer. Ibrahim leaned forward, voice steady. "When you've seen your mother hide tears behind smiles just to give you strength, you don't chase power, you chase justice." People in the audience wiped their eyes. Then Ibrahim added, "Leadership isn't about being above people. It's about standing beside them, even when it's hard. That pause again. This time Chris had nothing, just a quiet nod. Backstage, the producer whispered, "We didn't expect this." The world didn't either, but something powerful had begun. It was only chapter 4. Chris tried to change the subject. He shifted to politics, foreign affairs, military coups, anything to throw Ibrahim off. He came to power through a transition. Some say that's not democracy. Ibrahim folded his hands. Would you call it democracy when people die waiting for water, while politicians fly first class to conferences? Chris looked stunned. My people didn't elect me to wear suits and sit in palaces. They gave me a burden to fix what was broken, and I'm still learning. Chris softened a little. So you admit you're still learning? I hope I never stop, Ibrahim replied. A true leader must stay a student of the people's pain. Suddenly, Chris's bravado started to crack. He blinked fast, as if fighting something back. Ibrahim noticed but said nothing. The room was changing. Viewers watching from across the world weren't just entertained. They were shaken. This wasn't a show anymore. It was a mirror. Something in Chris Rock, the man who usually joked his way through pain, was starting to tremble. Because Ibrahim wasn't just answering questions. He was peeling away the layers of something far deeper. Even in America, truth has a way of cutting through. Chris leaned forward, his voice lower now. Unsure. Can I ask you something personal? Ibrahim nodded. Chris hesitated, then asked, What's your biggest fear as a leader? The question wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't meant to attack. It came from somewhere real, maybe a place Chris didn't even expect. Ibrahim closed his eyes for a second. Right. Then he said softly, My biggest fear is waking up one day and realizing I've become the kind of man my mother prayed I would never be. The entire room went quiet. He continued. She told me, If power ever makes you forget the poor, may God strip it from you. I live with those words every day. Chris covered his mouth. His voice cracked. My mom said something like that too. A single tear escaped his eye. Cameras caught it. And then the audience, so used to clapping for jokes, sat still, many with their hands over their mouths, others in tears. Ibrahim didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just looked at Chris and said, We are more alike than you think, brother. At that moment, walls fell, and the internet exploded. The podcast room grew warmer as Chris Rock shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The bravado that made him America's sharpest comedian seemed to falter as Ibrahim Traoré spoke calm and deliberate. Chris tried to regain control. But come on, he pushed. You've got all this power now. Be real. Isn't it tempting to enjoy it? Fly private. Sit on piles of cash. Forget the little people. Ibrahim just looked at him and smiled, but it wasn't smug. TTing, he repeated softly. Yes, I'm human. But I remember nights when my mother and I slept hungry. Nights when her tears wet the pillow beside me. I've already lived my worst temptation to stop caring. Chris didn't know what to say. His fingers tapped the table nervously. Then Ibrahim added, his voice lowering. Power can buy silence, but it cannot buy peace with yourself. Chris swallowed hard, and the audience, usually laughing at every line, sat frozen. Their eyes shifted not to Chris anymore, but to Ibrahim. Somewhere deep inside Chris, something was cracking open. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was personal. Chris, feeling cornered, leaned on what he knew best, jokes. So what? You're some kind of African saint now, he sneered. Savin'. Your country with hugs and speeches? The words hung heavy in the air. A few awkward chuckles came from the crew. But Ibrahim's expression didn't change. He leaned in slightly. Chris, I don't save my people. They save me every day. Chris blinked. They remind me why I cannot sleep. While children sleep in dirt, why I cannot laugh while mothers bury sons. You think this is funny? Chris shook his head instinctively. No, I didn't. But Ibrahim gently pressed on. I wish it were a joke, Chris. I wish every tear in Burkina Faso were part of a comedy. Then I could laugh too. But it's real, and I carry it here. He placed a hand on his chest. Chris dropped his gaze. The audience stared glassy-eyed, and for the first time all night, Chris Rock the man who could talk his way out of anything, was speechless. Chris's shoulders slumped. He fiddled with his pen, avoiding Ibrahim's steady gaze. "Why does this hit me so hard?" he finally muttered almost to himself. Ibrahim's voice softened. "Because you have a heart, and no matter how many jokes you tell, it feels what's right and wrong." A tear slipped down Chris's cheek before he could stop it. He chuckled bitterly, wiping it away. "Man, you're not supposed to make me cry on my own." But Ibrahim only smiled kindly. Sometimes tears are the beginning of healing. The audience was sniffling now. A few openly wept, no longer worried about cameras. And Chris looked at Ibrahim like he was seeing a different kind of man, not just a leader, but a brother in pain. The room stayed silent for what felt like forever, and Ibrahim leaned back, letting Chris have his moment. What no one knew yet was that this conversation, this breaking, would ripple across the world before the week was out. Because sometimes it takes one man's quiet strength to awaken the humanity we thought we'd lost. Chris wiped his face but couldn't stop the words. How? How did you become like this? Most people would get bitter, angry, not this calm. Ibrahim leaned back and let out a quiet breath. "You want to know what shaped me? I'll tell you." The audience leaned forward. He began softly. "When I was 10, my mother sold her last gold earrings just to buy us a bowl of rice. I remember asking her why she didn't eat, and she smiled, said, 'If my son eats, I'm full.'" Chris's face fell. That night, Ibrahim continued, his voice cracking. "She fainted from hunger while washing my school uniform. I swore if I ever had power, no mother in my country would ever have to choose like that again." You could hear sniffling in the room. Chris bowed his head and Ibrahim added, "I'm not strong because I want to be. I'm strong because I've seen too much weakness around me and it hurt." The truth hung in the air, raw and unforgettable. Chris tried to speak but choked on his words. The comedian who had mocked presidents and kings now stared at his desk, trembling. Slightly, Ibrahim placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Okay to feel it. That's what makes you human." The audience couldn't hold back anymore. Several were crying openly. Even the camera crew paused, one of them brushing away tears. Finally raised his head, his voice low. You remind me of my mom too. She used to clean houses for rich folks. I'd sit outside waiting for her shift to end. Hungry, embarrassed, but proud of her." Ibrahim nodded. "Then you understand why we can never forget where we come from." The two men just looked at each other. No jokes, no scripts, just two sons of strong women carrying their scars like armor. It wasn't just Chris who was breaking. The entire room felt it. And yet somehow in that breaking, there was healing. A long silence filled the studio. Then Chris, his voice shaking but honest, asked, "So what now? How do you keep going when it feels like you're carrying everyone's pain?" Ibrahim smiled faintly, a glint of tears in his own eyes. "I carry it because it reminds me I'm alive. The day I stop feeling it, I stop being a leader." Chris exhaled, his defenses gone. "Man, you're something else." Ibrahim patted his shoulder again, saying, "Only we all can be if we just choose to see each other." The crew erupted into quiet applause. In just under an hour, a podcast that was supposed to be funny had become a global lesson in humanity. And though neither man said it aloud, Chris and Ibrahim both knew the world would remember this moment forever. Chris took a shaky breath and then looked straight at Ibrahim, his voice cracking. "Tell me something. Do you ever feel lonely after all the speeches, the motorcades, the cameras? At night when it's quiet, do you feel alone?" The question stunned everyone. Even Ibrahim paused. He closed his eyes for a second before replying, "Yes, Chris, every night, every single night." A hush fell over the room. Ibrahim leaned forward, his voice low but strong. "When you lead, people think you're made of steel. They forget you bleed too, forget you dream. And you grieve and you long for someone to just say you're enough." Chris's lip trembled. A single tear rolled down his cheek. "Why do you keep going then?" he whispered. Ibrahim smiled faintly. "Because if I don't, who will? If I stop, what happens to the little boy who still believes his future depends on me?" The weight of his words broke through every wall in the room. Even Chris lowered his head, overcome by the quiet, aching truth. By now, the studio was silent except for muffled sobs. Chris tried to compose himself, but finally admitted, "You remind me of my brother. He died believing nobody cared about his pain. And here you are, carrying a whole nation's pain and still smiling." Ibrahim reached across the table and took Chris's hand. The gesture was so simple, yet so profound. "Your brother mattered," Ibrahim said softly. "And you matter. Never forget that." The audience couldn't hold back anymore. People openly wept, feeling as though Ibrahim was speaking directly to each of them. Chris broke down completely, burying his face in his hands as Ibrahim gently patted his back. The cameras kept rolling, but no one cared about the show anymore. This was no longer a podcast episode. It was a lesson in humanity, one the world desperately needed. And Ibrahim's calm, unwavering empathy was now teaching more than any speech or policy ever could. Unbeknownst to them, the live feed had already gone viral. Millions around the world were glued to their screens, watching Chris Rock, the man known for laughter, sobbing into his hands as Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly by his side, offering nothing but understanding. Hashtags started trending. True leader. Empathy matters. Istin with Ibrahim. Viewers in distant countries wrote comments. "I've never cried like this before. We need more leaders like him. This is what the world has been missing." Ibrahim glanced at the camera and said softly, almost as if speaking to the world, "Never underestimate the power of simply being kind. It may save someone's life." The chat section of the stream exploded with heart emojis, prayers, and thank yous. Even Chris wiped his face, whispered thank you, and gave Ibrahim a shaky smile. But Ibrahim only nodded, knowing this was not about him. It was about what he stood for. And in that moment, everyone watching believed again in leadership, in goodness, in hope. Chris took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, but his voice cracked. You make it look easy, carrying all that weight, smiling while the world judges you. I don't know how you do it." Ibrahim placed his hand over Chris's trembling fist. "It's never easy, Chris. It's a choice I make every morning too. Keep believing, even when the world seems broken." Chris's eyes glistened with fresh tears. "But doesn't it hurt? Doesn't it break you inside?" Ibrahim's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes," he admitted. "Every day it breaks me. But every night I sleep knowing that maybe, just maybe, I helped someone else feel whole." The quiet confession shattered what little composure Chris had left. His shoulders shook as he sobbed, the sound raw and real. The audience was no longer just watching a show. They were witnessing humanity at its purest. And it was impossible to hold back the tears. Even people behind the cameras wiped their eyes. In that moment, Ibrahim had done something no politician or celebrity could fake. He had touched hearts. As Chris buried his face in his hands, Ibrahim gently squeezed his shoulder. The silence in the studio was thick, but heavy, with love, not judgment. Then, one by one, people stood. First an audience member, then another, and then everyone. A standing ovation thundered through the studio, not for entertainment, but for the courage of one man to lead with empathy instead of ego. Chris stood too, wiping his tears. His voice was hoarser, but sincere. You're not just a leader. You're what we all wish we could be." Ibrahim shook his head. "No, Chris, I'm just a man, but every man has the power to choose kindness." The world was watching, and the live chat was flooded with hearts, prayers, and messages, crying uncontrollably. "This man is the hope we've been waiting for. God bless Ibrahim Traoré." Even Chris's last words before the cameras cut summed it up perfectly. "You didn't just silence me, Mr. President. You healed me." And for the first time that night, Ibrahim smiled fully, a smile full of quiet strength. The clip of the podcast went viral within hours. Millions of people from every corner of the world replayed the moment Ibrahim said, "Even when it breaks, you choose kindness always." News anchors called it one of the most powerful interviews of the decade. People who had lost faith in leadership began to believe again. Ibrahim himself didn't say much after the show, but as he walked out of the studio, he stopped to hug Chris one more time. "Thank you," Chris whispered, his voice breaking. "No," Ibrahim replied softly. Thank you for letting the world see we're all human. As the credits rolled on the podcast, comments poured in by the second. Thousands and thousands of voices echoing one truth. This is the kind of leader the world needs. The story ended not with applause, but with hope. And hope, after all, was what Ibrahim Traoré gave so freely. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart and brought tears to your eyes, please honor this message by liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Share your emotions. Let's keep the conversation of kindness and empathy alive. Your voice matters.